Welcome to Cultivating Wisdom with John Vervaeke. It's a pleasure to be here again with all of you. We do this, we live stream this every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We're coming to the end. Of our journey. We've had a long journey through the Eastern traditions of Buddhism and Taoism, and then we have picked up the journey through the Western traditions. We've gone through Epicureanism and Stoicism, and now we're into the final stretch when we look at cultivating wisdom within the culminating tradition of Neoplatonism. And so I'm excited to see how this comes together. So if you're joining us for the first time, please check for this in the description for this video, and you'll find links to all of what I've just described available to you. I recommend going back to, if you're just joining us, go back to lesson 1 from Meditating with John Vervaeke, work your way through the lessons, and then come into Cultivating Wisdom with John Vervaeke, work your way through the lessons, and hopefully you'll be able to join into the community, and you'll be able to keep meeting with us in the course. All right, so for today, we are going to do the usual practice. We're going to sit first, and then I will move to the whiteboard with the help of my son and Amar, and we'll do the Dharma talk, or maybe now that we're in the Western tradition, we should call it the Logos talk, and then we'll take hopefully there will be some time for some questions. All right, so get yourself in position, set your phones on Do Not Disturb. We'll begin, as I said, with chanting, and we'll begin together when I say the word begin. Begin. One. Begin your silent sit. slowly come out of your practice, trying his best to integrate what you cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas, perhaps by reciting the 5 promises to yourself. All right, we'll move over to the whiteboard. Okay, so I want to talk to you about Neoplatonism. And it's exciting to be here because I agree with the work of Arthur Vosloo that Neoplatonism is the cognitive cultural grammar of the spirituality of the West very broadly considered. I'm including Islam within that. The Sufi tradition is definitely deeply informed and empowered by the Neoplatonic tradition. Christianity, especially the mystical strands within Christianity, especially Eastern Orthodox Christianity, deeply, again, informed, transformed, empowered by Neoplatonism. The mystical traditions within Judaism, Kabbalah being one example, also deeply, deeply informed by Neoplatonism. I'm going to just get a couple of books. I'm off camera for a sec. So just a reminder of some of the texts we're using. Of course, the primary one we're going through, the absolutely mandatory, is McClelland's The Wisdom of Hypatia. And we're now moving into what he calls the Grove, what I'm calling university. We've done primary school with Epicureanism, high school with Stoicism, and now we're into the university. I mentioned Arthur Vosloo. I highly recommend this little gem of a book, Perennial Philosophy, in which he makes the argument that I've just made to you, amongst many other books. He is very prolific and very scholastic. I recommend this book for a very good introduction to Neoplatonism within the context of the argument on how it is the cultural cognitive grammar of the spirituality of the West. A couple of really good academic books. This won't mean much to you now, but this is probably one of the most important books. It's called Theurgia and the Soul by Gregory Shaw. This is an academic book, so it's not a practical book, but it helps to explain Theurgia, or what's called theurgy, and that needs a lot of explanation. I would complement that book. Obviously, McClelland has practices around Theurgia. Kupperman's book. I don't agree with everything in both McClelland and Kupperman, but nevertheless, these are two great books on the Neoplatonic practice of Theurgia. One more academic book I would recommend. Don't be put off by the title. It's a very good academic book. Divination and Human Nature, A Cognitive History of Intuition and Classical Antiquity. So a lot of practices that within our time have degenerated into psychic and magical practices, they weren't really understood. It's not proper to understand them the way we understand them now. As, for example, Strzok argues, and other people have argued, we should look at a lot of these theurgic practices instead of ways of cultivating a profound insight, or profound intuition, implicit learning, and aspiration. And so I'll talk about all of those things from a cognitive scientific perspective rather than any kind of supernaturalistic perspective, which is exactly what this book is about. So that, of course, is part of the challenge we're facing. I love Neoplatonism. I consider myself a Neoplatonist more than any other label that you might apply to me, including Buddhist or Taoist. And what I want to say about that is, because I love it so deeply and respect it so profoundly, I'm also aware, I think perhaps, I'm also aware because, not perhaps, I'm aware because of that, of its dangers and its defects. And I'm not recommending that we should go back to ancient forms of Neoplatonism. I do think we should take a look at the surviving living traditions of Neoplatonism, especially within Eastern Orthodox Christianity. That's the one that's often closest to us. But those of you who are from a Muslim background, Sufism, etc. And so what I'm proposing instead is what we've done before, which is, can we exact from ancient Neoplatonism a set of practices that we can weave into the practices, the ecology of practices that have emerged out of our studies together of Epicureanism and Stoicism, such that we get something viable and vital for us today. All right, so today what I want to do is I want to give you a bit of a background. This will complement the background of McLennan about what Neoplatonism is. Nobody in the ancient world called themselves a Neoplatonist. This is a modern scholastic term. Everybody in this tradition considered themselves a follower of Plato. We call it Neoplatonism because the Neoplatonists, while they saw themselves as continuous with Plato, actually were tremendously innovative, and I would say in a very beneficial way. So what I want to do is show you how they're kind of like the grand unified field theory of Western spirituality and wisdom cultivation. They basically are the summative integrative theory and ecology of practices for Western spirituality. So what I want to do is show you how they drew from some of the most important sources, obviously from Plato, that's going to be a primary source, but from Aristotle and from the Stoics as well. If I had a little bit more time, I'd talk about some of the influence of the skeptics, but I don't. That will come out when I do the series after Socrates. So what did they get from Plato? Okay, well, obviously Plato is where we get the more than just the portrayal, we get the exemplification of Socrates in the Platonic dialogues. We get to see Socrates practicing dialectic, engendering dialogos, trying to afford radical transformation. And we have seen how all of these traditions, as we've said, Socrates is to the Western traditions what Siddhartha is to Buddhism, right? The Epicureans, the Stoics, even more so, the Stoics were internalizing Socrates. And Plato, it's taken up. Now, the interesting thing about the Neoplatonists is, unlike the Stoics who tend to emphasize Socrates more, the Neoplatonists, as their name declares, are much more focused on Plato. So what are some of the ideas they got from Plato? Well, one of the most important, and we were already using it to some degree in the practice we did last week of invoking the Logos. Plato created the first psyche logos, suke logos, the first psychological theory, right? Suke logos, the first, right, logos of the suke, psychology, right, psychological theory in history, and he used it in order to try and explain. He was trying to figure out why people fell into self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Now, the reason why I'm invoking this is that this insight of Plato has proved to be such a profound insight. We keep rediscovering it in the West, within Western psychology. I'll give you a couple of examples once I explain it to you. So what Plato was interested in is, well, why do we fall into self-deception? So what's the basic idea that he got from Socrates? We fall into self-deception when the salience and the intensity of something, and we've seen this all the way through this tradition, when the salience and the intensity of something is uncoupled from the truth and our understanding of it. Now, when it's uncoupled and we're in a state of wonder and the salience and the intensity is beyond our current understanding, but that motivates us to question and to wonder. Well, that's right, to seek more understanding, and that's Socrates, because wisdom begins in such wonder. But the opposite of that is something like what Harry Frankfurt calls the phenomena of bullshit, where the salience and the intensity is uncoupled from our concern for truth and understanding, such that we don't question, we don't wonder, we have a pretentious certainty, and we run headlong into, and we jump to conclusions. And that is the primary way in which we fall into self-deception. Now, Plato took that idea, but he wanted to understand, well, how does the salience and the understanding become so unglued? And he looked at something. It's a very powerful experience for all of us, and one we encounter in a spiritual pathway. He looked at inner conflict. And there's a lot of current cognitive science that backs up the model I'm now going to talk to you about. He noticed that, let's say I want to lose weight, right? So I want to lose weight, and then there's a part of me that knows, right? And he called this his reason, and he sort of put it, and Plato was, for his time, one of the least sexist thinkers. He recommended that women could also rule, also be in the army, but, right, he's still in the ancient world. Athens is a horrible place for women, ancient Athens. But he represented this with a man in your head, and this is a part of you that can grasp long-term goals. It can, right? It's capable of abstract thought in that sense. Not things that are currently present. It allows you to grab abstract goals. It allows you to see the abstract or invisible properties of things. So I'm, right, I want to improve my health. That's a very abstract phenomenon. It's long-term, and I'm motivated by, the truth of things. That seems to, what happens is I come home and there's the chocolate cake on the counter, and I want the chocolate cake. It's super, super salient. And he said this is like a monster on us. And, sorry, I want to keep it parallel structure for you guys. There's the monster. And then he called this part, the part of you that's your appetites. And that means sexual, food, everything. And he put this sort of in your stomach and your genitalia. Right? So this doesn't grasp long-term goals. It's about what's happening right here, right now. It's urgent, it's superficial, it's super salient, it's intense, and it works in terms of pleasure and pain. Okay, so in contrast, short-term, superficial, works in terms of pleasure. And then in between, right, there is, I'm going to erase this now, although I'll keep doing this parallel structure. Just in between was the fact that we're social cultural beings. I'm going to use the Greek word here because we don't have a good English word for this. We do not have a good English word for this. So the Greek word is thymos. It's in your chest. So think of where you feel all the social emotions, where you feel pride and honor, and notice what my hands are doing, the expansion, or guilt and shame, the contraction, right? So it's that movement. That's the thymos. And he said this is like a lion, and as you may have expected, it's in your chest. So this doesn't work in terms of pleasure and pain or truth and falsity. It works in terms of honor and shame, pride and guilt. This is the socio-cultural aspect of you. And so this is the part of you that it doesn't work in terms of completely abstract long-term goals, but it's not just at the urgent bidding of the current stimulus. Instead, it has to do with your connectedness to other people and your connectedness to other people. Now, I put it this way. You could put this on top because maybe it has to do with morality. The ordering is just so it lines up like with you as an enacted symbol of this. And here's the idea, right? The man can actually learn. Right? It's capable of forming theories and explanations. The lion isn't really capable of learning, but the lion can be trained. So the man can learn the theory, sorry for the sexist language, and that theory can be learned to use to train the lion. That's what we're doing, by the way. And notice that this ultimately requires sociocultural interaction. It requires that we do things with others, because he chose the lion because the lions are social cats, right? They form prides, and notice the association to pride, by the way. Okay, so you learn the theory, and then you can train the lion, and then you can tame the monster. You don't want to kill anything, because we need all of these. Sometimes you need your monster. You need to eat. You need to run away from the threat. And sometimes, of course, the lion should be predominant because it's a social situation, and you should be picking up on other people appropriately, treating them as persons within a community of people. And then, of course, there's times, we're doing it more here, where we emphasize the man and we're trying to learn. When we get this properly organized, we can deal with the fact that the man on his own is largely impotent. When I come in and I see the chocolate cake, my knowing, having the beliefs that I shouldn't eat it, and this is supported by a lot of evidence, by the way, is largely insufficient, even almost impotent at stopping me from eating the cake. But if I learn about how to improve my health and join Weight Watchers, or maybe join a Sangha and learn meditation, right, then I can use the social power of the lion to implement the theory and tame the monster. So when and we know all about this, this is ataraxia. And we've been talking about this all through Epicureanism and Stoicism. This is inner peace. Now, Plato has a brilliant idea about this. He has what we're trying to do, he says this is something like an inner form of justice. We're trying to get everything in the right relationship so that each can get the most life it can without, right, diminishing the lives of the two others. So if the lion is too much, it will, right, it could kill the monster. You can think of people who are super ascetic and destroy their bodies and are irrational, right? The man, of course, can fall into all kinds of rumination and anxiety and screw this all up. And of course, the monster can overwhelm. What you want is something like a just society within. And when that happens, you get the fullest possible being you can have. Each one lives the most it can without trespassing or at the expense of the others. So they have although individually each one could be greater, there is an optimal relationship between the inner society. And you have a fullness of being. And one of Plato's great understandings, one of his great insights, is one of the things that drives our spiritual pursuits is we want this inner peace, this fullness of being. This is a meta drive. In addition to all of how we try to satisfy our individual drives or desires, we want the satisfaction of our desires to be something that affords and empowers ataraxia, this inner peace, this fullness of being. So inner peace isn't just a lack of conflict, it's a fullness of being. It is to realize yourself in a profound way. Okay. So the Neoplatonists have a very sophisticated way of making use of this psychological theory. Now that theory, it just keeps coming back. Some of you will recognize Freud in it. Some of you will recognize the dual, or what's now called triple processing models that are all the rage within cognitive science and cognitive psychology. So we keep coming back to this because so much evidence keeps converging on this. But here's the idea that Plato that really got. So when I don't have inner justice, a virtue he called sophrosin, when I don't have that inner justice, what's going to happen is I'm not going to have my salience and my understanding properly and my actions properly coordinated. So if I'm if I haven't cultivated that inner justice, which is one important pole or aspect of wisdom, then when I come into a situation, let's, for example, the chocolate cake, the salience of the cake overwhelms my understanding and my grasp of the truth, and that is exactly why I fall into this self-destructive bit. I deceive myself. Oh, it's okay to eat the cake right now, and then that's self-destructive behavior. So the imbalance causes self-deception. It actually disconnects me from the world. I'm not connected to the reality of things appropriately. This connects me from my future self that I'm trying to cultivate. It will ultimately disconnect me from others because I will act, for example, greedily. I will not act properly virtuously. And if you say, well, I'll act morally, then you're starting to invoke the lion, and you're already starting to move towards a coordination. So let's do the opposite then. Let's say I've started to cultivate some ataraxia. What does that mean? Well, it means I'm decreasing my self-destructive behavior. Okay? And what does that mean? Well, that means actually, because of that, I start to see into, insight, I start to see into the real patterns of the world. And we'll come back to what Plato means by these real patterns. And I see, not just in the sense of getting an idea, I am fitted, I'm more appropriately fitted. So you could even put realize, right, the real patterns of the world. Now, as I start to pick up on the real patterns of the world, I actually gain some real knowledge. I start to understand how particular patterns operate. I can then internalize that. I can use that understanding of real patterns to see into the real patterns of my own psyche. I look into the patterns of my own psyche, which means I get a better, oh, wait, that's a better way in which the psyche should be coordinated and organized. And you see what starts happening? Now I get more ataraxia. I reduce my self-destructive behavior. I start to fit more into the real patterns. The real patterns can be internalized. And you know what this is. You've seen it before. This is reciprocal opening. It's no coincidence that, Mark Lewis came up with the idea of addiction as reciprocal narrowing, and then he acknowledged to me that it has an opposite, which is reciprocal opening. It plugs into this deep model of Plato. This cycle is called anagogy. Now, we have a meta drive for inner peace, and then what Plato saw is we also have a meta drive here. In addition to whatever satisfies our desires or our wants, we want what satisfies it to be real or true. I can give you tons of examples. I'll just give you a quick one. I do this all the time in my class. I'll ask my students, how many of you are in a really satisfying romantic relationship? They put up their hands. Okay? How many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you, even if that means the complete destruction of the relationship? About 95% of the people keep up their hands. They're willing to sacrifice all of this pleasure, all of this comfort, all of this joy, because it's not real. Okay? So we want to be connected. So the idea in Platonic spirituality is about satisfying these two fundamental meta drives, the drive for inner peace and the drive to be in contact with what's real. And what Plato says is if we do it right, if we cultivate wisdom with the right ecology of practices, these will be mutually reinforcing in a positive feedback cycle, and we'll get reciprocal opening. And that's anagogy. That's anagogy. So Neoplatonism is basically the philosophy religion of anagogy. Okay, so what are these real patterns? We won't get through all of this today, and I still have to tell you next time we're going to be together how the Neoplatonists draw from Aristotle, how they draw from the Stoics, and then what the basic form of practice. So the introduction is going to take today and next Saturday, and then we'll get into the ecology of practices. But you need to understand this background, just like I gave you a background for Epicureanism, and I gave you the background for Stoicism. So what are these real patterns that I mentioned? Well, we already make a distinction in science that's helpful to start us. We make a distinction between patterns that are just correlations and patterns that are causal. And one of the big things you learn, and it takes a lot of discipline, you have to discipline yourself with discernment and open yourself up to the disclosure of the world. That's what a really good experiment is in order to make this. I'm going to express a little bit of frustration. I'm tired of people who don't appreciate enough the discipline, right, of science. Science, that means scientia, to know. You have to, right? We are so beset by self-deceptive cognitive biases that we need to do a lot of training in order to distinguish correlations from causation. That's what science is all about. And it's really hard. It's really hard. And if you're going to say I reject science, then tell me, please, your better method for distinguishing causation from correlation. Because if you don't have one, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to listen to you. So why am I emphasizing that? Because there's a tendency for people who are attracted to Neoplatonism to take an anti-scientific attitude. That is not Hypatia's attitude. Hypatia was one of the greatest scientists of her time. And there is a deep and long-standing tradition of the interconnection between science and Neoplatonism. John Spencer's book, right, The Eternal Law, argues for the historical fact, that many of the pivotal figures at the beginning of the scientific revolution were deeply influenced explicitly by Neoplatonism. All right. So, when I was being brought up in a Christian fundamentalist family, right, I would hear things like, things have gotten so much worse since we took prayer out of the schools, right? By the way, that's not true, but let's say it was. Now, that's a correlation. The problem with correlations, two things are in correlation, but you don't know, is A causing B? Your intuitions will say that, but it can turn out that it's B that's causing A, or often A and B have no causal relation, they're both being caused by C. And your intuitions and your untrained observation can't distinguish these. There's things you have to do. So, let's go back to the correlation. Well, we took prayer to the school and crime rates went up. Actually, it didn't, but let's say that's the case. Well, I want you to notice something else. Here's greenhouse gases going up across time. Here's Caribbean piracy. It's been going down across time. Do you see what the problem is? Greenhouse gases are going up because we have stopped practicing Caribbean piracy. So we need to get on some wooden ships and sail around the Caribbean, and that will deal with global warming. Now you laugh and it's absurd. But notice that many times things are absurd because we are confusing correlation and causation. So the first step at getting to the real patterns that Plato was on about was a careful reflection, trying to distinguish initially the causal patterns from the correlational patterns, practicing doing that. Now, he didn't have the full-blown scientific method, but he saw the necessity of critical theoretical debate and discussion in order to try and discern the difference between correlation and causation. So, using science, notice that we can, as an analogy, we can talk about the real patterns. We can talk about there's patterns of causation. Like if I put sugar in water, it dissolves. And then those patterns of causation are actually, maybe I'll do it this way. Maybe this makes more sense now. The Neoplatonists have an upward metaphor, but now we have a more downward metaphor. So here's some causal patterns in the world. And what scientists do, right, is they try to find deeper structural patterns. Right? They try to find systems of patterns. And then they ultimately try to find the principles, or using a legal term, the laws that regulate those patterns. And this is virtually, it's a version of what you're trying to do in Neoplatonism. You're trying to realize first the patterns that are unfolding in your environment, then the systems, the structures that those patterns are within, and then ultimately the governing principles that science is Neoplatonic through and through, that ultimately the governing principles of that. So Plato had a theory about this, and it's the idea that we're trying to realize what he called it the eidos, and we translate it this is like translating logos with word, the word word. It's a legitimate translation, but it's radically insufficient. And so what I want to talk to you about next time is I want to talk to you about how Plato understood this. But before this seems too strange to you, think about how we did this when we did invoking the logos, right? We were picking up on the physis, the way things are unfolding, right? And then we were picking up on the intelligibility, the system, the systematic structure. So we sat like a mountain, which is we got into the basic presencing, right? The weight of it. Then we sat like a poppy and we tried to turn and orient ourselves towards the sun. We'll see how Plato makes use of the metaphor of the sun. We're trying to orient ourselves to the real patterns, the causal patterns. And then after we sat like a poppy, we sat like an ocean. We tried to pick up on the overarching structure, right? The overall flow in and out, the arising and passing away, the system. And then, we moved into the musicality, the intelligibility, how it all makes sense. So we'll see how we're moving through here. And then we pointed towards the source, the ultimate principle. We were doing this. We were enacting it. We were invoking it as we were doing the invocation of the logos. We were already practicing anagogy, because as we did it within, we did it without. And as we aligned within the microcosm, we found the alignment without the macrocosm. And we started to do the anagogic ascent. So I'm going to talk a lot more next time about Plato's theory of the forms and how that gives us an understanding of a deeper understanding of anagogy and participation. And then we'll be able to move into Aristotle and how his theory of knowledge by conformity was taken into Neoplatonism. And then we'll see what Neoplatonism draws from the Stoics in terms of, again, the logos, internalization, self-discipline, the civic virtues that prepare you for purification and at-one-ment. And then we'll be ready to talk about Neoplatonism proper, what its main ideas are, the innovations it brought in. So like I said, this might take one or maybe even two more lectures. I guess that's what this is. Sorry. So we get the background we needed. Because again, this is the summative, it's simultaneously the grand unified theory and the grand unified ecology of practices of the entire Western wisdom tradition. And that's why we keep perennially, this is Verse Lewis's point, We perennially keep turning to it again and again and again. It is the inexhaustible fountain that we turn to for the spirituality that puts us directly and continuously in touch with the inexhaustible source of the intelligibility of being itself for us. And this is simultaneously something abstract and yet transcendent in that sense, but also deeply, deeply immanent in the very guts. Think about the tripart soul, the tripart psyche, if you might prefer that term, right? In the very guts of your being. Okay, so I'm now going to go back to the meditation pillow. Jason will switch the camera, and then what we'll do is we'll take a look at any questions people might have. Now, please be patient with me. Neoplatonism is, I can't give you the background like I could with Epicureanism or Stoicism. Well, I spread that background over a couple of talks too. I need 2 or 3 talks to give you what you need for understanding. And then, as we're going along, you'll see, and I've already tried to indicate, more and more how this, right, affords, impregnates, and empowers an ecology of practices that we're going to take a deep look at together. And then that will bring us to the end of the wisdom of Hypatia. Are there any questions? Oh, Brett, thank you for doing the Philosophical Fellowship demonstration. You're welcome, Brett. I want to thank everybody, Tracy, Kira, Rob, and of course Amar behind the scenes working his magic. We will see how the Philosophical Fellowship is actually an important bridging practice, as I indicated, between like Epicureanism and aspects of Stoicism, and we'll see how it therefore also prepares us for the practice of dialectic. That's one of the core practices within Neoplatonism. So there's actually a pedagogical program as you move through elementary school, high school, and university, and that program is really important. If you skip to the end, if you jump to the conclusion, you are falling into foolishness. You are falling into foolishness. Are there any other questions that anybody else wants to ask about perhaps today's talk? There's another question coming up. Lizelle, good to hear from you again. Is correlation patterns necessarily bad? I have a lot of meaningful coincidences in my life, so I worry. The way I think I would put that is, remember, always trying to balance discernment, how we can best see through misleading appearances, and disclosure, opening ourselves up for how the world may correct what we see. Discernment and disclosure, always in coordination. So if you don't confuse correlation with causation, if you treat it just as correlation and don't treat it as if it is causation, then of course there's no mistake, because treating a correlation as a correlation is treating it as it is. The danger for us is it's very hard for our brains, who are prediction-hungry machines, to leave correlations just as correlations. We start to behave and believe that there are causes. Now, some of the correlations might be causes. Just because something's a correlation doesn't preclude it from being a cause. All causes are also correlations. It's just that not all correlations, most correlations aren't causes. And so if there's a correlation and you're being I think this is the right word, tempted into believing that it's a causal pattern, then you have to do the hard work. We have to do the hard work because it should be done in concert with other people of, rational reflection, empirical investigation, to determine if there's good reason and good evidence for concluding that the correlational pattern is a causal pattern. And like the degree to which you can do that work is the degree to which you can have confidence that you are discovering a causal pattern rather than a correlational pattern. The degree to which you can't do the work, and so many of us can't because we don't have opportunity, we don't have resources, or also there might be temperamental issues or trauma issues. I want to be sensitive to all of that. But the degree to which we can't do that is the degree to which we have to practice the Stoicism. We have to practice realizing that if we treat correlations as causes, we are doing the projective thing that the Stoics warned us against. We have to do epoche. We have to bracket and realize, no, I shouldn't treat this as anything more than a correlation. Any other questions? That was an excellent question. Well, we're pretty much out of time anyway. I want to thank you all for joining. As always, I want to thank my beloved son, Jason, my dear friend and technomage, Amar. Please subscribe to the channel to be notified of the next video. If it's not against your principles, please follow me on Twitter for updates about these streams, updates about other things that are happening, like talks I'm giving, or talks I'm recommending, or there's just so much happening right now. It's really quite exciting and quite wonderful. Please invite others who might benefit from sharing this series, or also connect them up also to the meditation series, perhaps also to the lecture series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, or the Dialogos series, Voices with Vervaeke. So please remember, we are doing this every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Continuity of practice is more important than quantity of practice. Don't hold yourself to the standard of a vicious perfectionism, but a virtuous friendship. Because in the end, there is no enemy worse than your own mind and body, but there is no friend, no ally, no true companion on the path that is better than your own mind and body. Be lamps unto yourselves and to each other. Take good care, everyone. I'll see you next Saturday.